In our previous videos, we have been looking at what changes demand and supply. So we made a list of the 6 things that change demand. So let's just write those here. Right, we had change in income, change in preferences or quality. We had changes in expectations of future income. We had expectations of changes in future prices. Ugh. All right, what else do we have? We had a change in the number of buyers, and we had prices of related goods. Right, substitutes and complements. Then we had 6 things that change supply. And what were those 6? Okay. We had the number of producers or sellers. We had changes in technology. We had changes in the cost of inputs, those factor payments. We had a change in business taxes, which would impact the cost of those inputs, right? Because when we look at the taxes for a business, for the customer, it's rolled into the price, but for the business, additional taxes are a cost. Okay, so what else are we missing? We have 2 more. We have price of related goods. And remember, for the customer, related goods were substitutes and complements. How do we distinguish for the business perspective? This was substitutes in production and complements in production. All right, we're missing one more change in supply. What am I forgetting here? Expectations of future prices. And this was where a business could decide to ramp up production, which would increase supply, or to stockpile and not put it on the market, which would decrease supply. So we have this list here of things that change demand and things that change supply. So we want to be able to look at a news article, for example, and be able to determine, is it a change to the customer? Is it a change to the business? Which of these 6 determinants is changing? That'll help us figure out, as we look at our demand and supply, is demand or supply changing, and is it increasing or decreasing? Because if we can identify that something is an increase in supply, we can then predict the prices will fall. Well, real life gets even more complicated because when we derive economic models, we are simplifying. We change one thing and we see what happens. We hold everything else constant, ceteris paribus. But in real life, many of these things could be changing. We could have changes in demand and changes in supply that are all influencing price. So what we want to do is practice looking at changes in both demand and supply. What does that do to price? And then I challenge you to find some news articles and look at, is demand changing? Is supply changing? What should be happening to the overall price? So before we get into the articles though, let's simply look at changes in demand and supply that are simultaneous. What does that do to price? So let's start with the first scenario. What if demand and supply both increase equally? So let's draw a graph. All right. Demand, supply, price, quantity, and let's label our current equilibrium Q1, P1. And in this example, demand and supply are both increasing. So an increase in demand is a shift to the left or the right? It is a shift to the right. So if that was the only thing that was changing, then at the current price, quantity demanded be more than quantity supplied, we would have a shortage, it would drive up the price. But in this case, we are also seeing an increase in supply. And it is the same size increase in supply. So we want to show that on our graph, an increase in supply is a shift to the right. Go away. And we want that shift to the right, that change in supply this way, to be the same distance as that shift in demand to the right that way. So the increase in demand, we said, would make the price go up. But if we're also seeing a simultaneous increase in supply, then that increase in supply causes the price to go down, which if the two are happening at the same time, notice there is no change in price, but both of them cause quantity to go up. So if both supply and demand increase, the effect on price and quantity is that the price remains the same, but the quantity increases. What if demand and supply both decrease and that decrease is the same amount? So if we were to draw that on our graphs here, demand, supply, a decrease in demand is a shift to the left. A decrease in supply is also a shift to the left. And the price, again, would stay the same, but the overall quantity would go down. What happens, though, if the size of the change in demand and supply are not the same? So what if you have an increase in demand that is bigger than the increase in supply? What happens to the price and the quantity sold? All right, so let's draw our graph here. Demand, supply. And what we're showing here is an increase in demand is greater than the increase in supply. So we want a big increase in demand. And that increase in demand would make the price go up. If at the same time we have an increase in supply, but it's a smaller increase in supply, increases in supply make the price go down. It's always great to note your equilibrium so you can keep track. The increase in demand made the price go up. The increase in supply made the price go down. But we can mark where we started and where we finished. So notice that if both demand and supply are increasing, but the increase in demand is bigger, the overall change is that the price goes up. But it doesn't go up the full amount that the demand alone would have caused. In both the increase in supply and the increase in demand make the quantity go up. So here, an increase in demand, an increase in supply, both quantity and price go up. What if instead, though, the increase in supply was bigger? So let's go back to our graph. Price, quantity, demand, supply. So in this case, we have a big increase in supply, a smaller increase in demand. It doesn't matter which change you do first, as long as you mark kind of where you start and where you end. So we'll mark here P1, Q1. And we have a little increase in demand. That little increase in demand would make the price go up. So I'll mark 1, 2. And then we have a really big increase in supply. So notice that increase in supply, much bigger than the increase in demand. Increases in supply make prices go down. So we can mark where we start and where we finish. And notice that the overall change to price is the price fell. The increase in demand and the increase in supply caused the quantity to go up, but because the increase in supply was bigger, the price ultimately fell. we go back to our list here. Price falls, quantity increases. Now, what if demand increases and supply decreases, but their changes are equal? Demand increases, supply decreases. So we mark our starting point, P1, Q1, demand increases. We want supply to decrease, which is a shift to the right or the left. It's a shift to the left. And you want the distance here along the horizontal, so the distance between your supplies and the distance between your demands to be equal in this case. Okay, demand was increasing, supply was decreasing. So we mark our starting point, that was here. We increase demand and that makes the price go up. We decrease supply and that makes the price go up even more. So if we mark our starting point and our ending point, notice overall the price just kept going up. But because we had an increase in demand and a decrease in supply, the quantity didn't change. So if we're trying to explain what we're observing out in the real world, we need to recognize, is demand changing? Is supply changing? Are they both changing? And is it an increase and a decrease? Is it an increase or a decrease? And which is bigger? Because it's quite possible that multiple things are happening in the real world at the same time, and some of those changes are causing prices to go up, and some of them are causing prices to go down. So there's pressure in the market going different directions. We need to know which is having the bigger impact to ultimately determine what's going to be happening to prices and the quantity sold. Let's do one last one. Demand decreases and supply increases. And here we have them change equally. So let's just draw our graph here. Demand, supply. In this case, demand was decreasing. Okay, D2. So we started here, P1, Q1. And we had demand decreasing and we had supply increasing. So an increase in supply is a shift to the left or the right? To the right. So the distance here should be equal to the distance there if they are equal in effect. And we have demand decreasing, supply increasing. We started here. We decreased demand, we increased supply. So overall, where did we end up? The price went down and the quantity didn't change. So when we observe price changes out in the real world, we need to ask ourselves, is it customers changing their behavior, businesses changing their behavior, or both? And is it an increase or a decrease in demand or supply? Which is having the bigger effect that's driving the price? If you understand these pieces, and even if you can put them into graphs, you can then predict what's coming, what's going to happen to the price in the market, what's going to happen to the quantity sold.